Okay, so what we need to do now is we need to introduce a foreign sector into the model, and then we'll be able to think about what happens when home and foreign trade with each other. So we're going to have, let's write up here, we've got home, and we've got the unit labor requirements for home. First for wine and then for cheese. And then we've got the amount of labor that home has to work with. We're going to add foreign, and we're going to have a unit labor requirement for wine. For foreign, we're just going to denote that with an asterisk. The unit labor requirement for wine for foreign, and then foreign will have some supply of labor. L and L asterisk don't need to be the same. Now, our unit labor requirements can follow any pattern that we want. We could have home's production possibility frontier be flatter than foreign's, or we could have foreign's be flatter than home's. So it all depends upon the numbers that we use for the unit labor requirements. So let's draw the production possibility for frontier for both home and foreign, and we'll draw them in general, and then we'll be able to compare them. So let's put home here, we'll put foreign here. We're going to put the quantity of cheese down here for each of them. This will be the quantity of cheese in foreign. I could denote that with an asterisk also. We've got the quantity of wine up here. And then we're going to have our production possibilities frontier, and the slope of the production possibilities frontier is going to be determined by the unit labor requirements. And so we're not going to put numbers to them. Let's just in general draw a production possibilities frontier. And the slope of this production possibilities frontier, remember, is going to be the ratio of the unit labor requirement, and the one that's going to be on top is going to have to do with this good up here. So it's going to be the unit labor requirement for cheese divided by the unit labor requirement for wine. The end points here are going to be determined by how much labor we've got divided by the unit labor requirement for that good. So this end point here would be labor divided by the unit labor requirement for wine. And down here we would have the amount of labor divided by the unit labor requirement for cheese. Foreign will have a production possibilities frontier. The slope of its production possibilities frontier is going to be determined by the ratio of the unit labor requirements. I see that this one says W. That should be a C right there. So this slope here is going to be determined by the unit labor requirement for cheese in foreign divided by the unit labor requirement for wine in foreign. So that should be a C. I won't put the endpoints here, but the endpoints would be the same in foreign. It would be foreign's labor supply divided by the unit labor requirement for cheese in foreign. So there's our production possibilities frontiers, or two of them, and we're assuming here that home, let's make sure we label this home, home has a comparative advantage in the production of cheese. We can see that because home's production possibilities frontier is flatter than foreign's. The other side of that coin is that foreign has a comparative advantage in wine. So if these countries specialized, then home would specialize in cheese, foreign would specialize in wine, home would export cheese to foreign, foreign would export wine to home. So that's what our production possibilities frontiers look like for home and foreign. What we really need to figure out here is we need to add another layer to this. We need to figure out how the world price of cheese and wine is determined. That's something that in a principles class you never talk about. If you go back to the farmer-rancher example, remember that in that example what we did is we just assumed that the rancher came to the farmer with a possible trade, right, of 5 ounces of meat for 15 ounces of potatoes. And I always tell students in a principles class, don't worry about where that comes from, but now we need to figure out where that comes from. And as you can probably imagine, like everything in economics, or almost everything in economics, it has to do with demand and supply. What we need to do now is we need to talk about what kind of demand and supply. Typically, probably everything you've done in economics up to this point, or at least a vast majority of it, would be what we call partial equilibrium analysis. And partial equilibrium analysis is where you're thinking about a single market. So if we were to think about the market for gasoline, we could talk about the demand curve and the supply curve. We could use the determinants of demand and supply to think about how the demand curve and or the supply curve would shift and what would happen to the price and what would happen to the equilibrium quantity. That's partial equilibrium analysis, where we're just thinking about that particular market. But you probably also know that things that happen in that market also have effects on other markets. So for example, if the price of gasoline goes up, gasoline is an important input into the production of most other goods. And so for those other goods, if the price of gas goes up, that's going to be an increase in input prices, which will affect the supply curve in those other markets. What we need to do here, since we're thinking about 2 different markets, we've got the market for cheese and the market for wine, we need to think about what economists call a general equilibrium analysis. And that's where you're thinking about how the changes in one market impact the other market. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do a relative demand and supply discussion here. And it's probably something you haven't seen before, but it's not anything that is really that challenging. We're going to be thinking about relative price, which you have heard before. Economists always talk about relative prices. One price by itself doesn't matter. What matters is that price compared to the other prices. But we're also going to think about a relative quantity. Okay? And that you may not have seen before. So let's think about what this would look like if we went to our farmer-rancher example. I'm going to draw the relative demand and relative supply curve in this picture, or for this general example, but I think it'll be easier to understand if we go back to our farmer-rancher example, do it with some numbers here, and then it'll be easier to understand what the general example looks like. So I'm going to redraw my farmer-rancher example, and we'll kind of go through that. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller here. So remember when we were talking about the farmer and the rancher, so here's our farmer, we've got a rancher. There we were talking about meat and potatoes, and we had potatoes down here. I'm just going to put P. And we had meat up here. Let's just call that M. Our farmer, the farmer's production possibilities frontier looked something like this, where if they produced only meat, they could make 8 units of meat, and if they produced only potatoes, they could make 32 units. Our rancher's production possibilities frontier looked something like this, where they could produce 24 units of meat and 48 units of potatoes. We had a slope, of course, for the farmer of the production possibilities frontier of 1/4, and a slope for the rancher of 1/2. Okay, so that's the example that we developed earlier. We know that the farmer has a comparative advantage in the production of potatoes, and the rancher has a comparative advantage in the production of meat. What we're going to be thinking about here is we're going to think about the relative price and the relative quantity. So let's put up here what the relative price is going to look like. You've seen that before. The relative price is going to be the price of potatoes divided by the price of meat. And we're going to think about the quantity, relative quantity, and that's going to be the total amount of potatoes produced divided by the total amount of meat produced. And so what that's going to look like is going to be the quantity of potatoes that is produced by the farmer plus the quantity of potatoes produced by the rancher, let's designate that with an asterisk, divided by the quantity of meat produced by the farmer plus the quantity of meat produced by the rancher. So we've got a relative price and we've got a relative quantity. Okay? And that probably seems weird at first, but it's not weird. We're going to be thinking about how much meat the farmer produces and how much potatoes the farmer produces. Let's think about the situation where they both specialize. If the farmer specialized in potatoes and the rancher specialized in meat, then the quantity of potatoes produced by the rancher is 0 and the quantity of meat produced by the farmer is 0. So it'll be easy, I think, once we get into it. Now let's talk about what the relative demand and the relative supply picture is going to look like. So this is going to be a demand-supply picture. Up here on the vertical axis, we're going to have the relative price. That's going to be the price of potatoes divided by the price of meat. And on our horizontal axis, we're going to have quantity, only it's going to be the relative quantity. It's going to be the quantity of potatoes produced by the farmer plus the quantity of potatoes produced by the rancher divided by the quantity of meat produced by the farmer plus the quantity of meat produced by the rancher. Let's start by thinking about the relative supply curve. I'm going to put a couple of points on here for our relative price, because the relative prices that obviously are going to be important here are going to be this 1/4 and this 1/2. Obviously our 1/4 is right here and our 1/2 is right here. So let's talk about why those are important. So if we think about the world, and by world I mean between our farmer and our rancher, if we think about a relative price of potatoes that is lower than 1/4, okay, a relative price of potatoes that's lower than 1/4. If we think back to our ISO value line, remember the value of any of these bundles on here, if we picked a point on this production possibilities frontier and we drew the ISO value line through that point, that would represent all of the bundles that have the same value. And we could compare bundles on this production possibilities frontier and see which one of them they would choose to produce. Well, if the relative price of potatoes is less than 1/4, the bundle that would maximize the value of production would be right up here. The farmer would specialize in meat. The rancher would also specialize in meat. So if the relative price of potatoes is less than 1/4, both people specialize in meat. That means the quantity of potatoes for each person up here is a 0. And so the supply curve is this portion of the vertical axis. There is no production of potatoes if the relative price of potatoes is below 1/4. Now let's think about what happens if the relative price of potatoes is equal to 1/4. Well, if it's equal to 1/4, then the slope of the ISO value line would be the exact same for the farmer as the slope of their production possibilities frontier. And they would be indifferent between production of any of these points. They don't care. It depends on how much meat and potatoes people want to consume. The rancher, on the other hand, if the slope of the ISO value line is 1/4, that's less than 1/2, so this endpoint right up here would maximize the value of their production. So they're still going to produce 24 units of meat, no potatoes. So we get a horizontal section on our relative supply curve. The farmer could produce a large amount of meat and not very much potatoes, or a lot of potatoes and not very much meat. They're indifferent. If we think about a relative price of potatoes that's in between 1/4 and 1/2, then that's the example that we always think about in a principles class, where the farmer will specialize in what they have the comparative advantage in, and the rancher will specialize in what they have the comparative advantage in. In other words, this will be the production point for the farmer, this will be the production point for the rancher. And so we get a vertical segment. in between 1/4 and 1/2, because both of them would specialize in what they have the comparative advantage in. And we'll talk about what this relative quantity is. Actually, let's do that right now. This relative quantity is easy to figure out because that's the quantity of potatoes produced in total divided by the quantity of meat produced in total. The quantity of potatoes produced in total is going to be 32 units. And we know that because that's going to be the production production point for the farmer. They're going to produce 32 units of potatoes, no meat. The total amount of meat produced is going to be 24 units. So that's something a little bit more than 1, the relative quantity of potatoes to meat. Okay? If we think about a world relative price of potatoes equal to 1/2, well, that's equal to the slope of the production possibilities frontier for the rancher. So the rancher now is going to be indifferent between any of these possible production points. The farmer would specialize still in potatoes, right? Because at a ISO value line with a slope that's more than 1/4, that's going to be their production point right there. So we get another horizontal segment on our relative supply curve. And so this is what we would call the supply curve with this relative demand, relative supply model that we're thinking about. Okay? So it's still an upward sloping supply curve. It looks like a set of steps, but that shouldn't bother you. Okay? What we're going to be doing then is we're going to be adding a relative demand curve, and our relative demand curve is going to come down and intersect that relative supply curve. Let's draw an example. It's going to look like, let's call this, I started to put relative demand, but let's just call it demand. We're still going to be finding the intersection of that demand and supply curve, and that's going to determine the world relative price of potatoes, and it will determine the relative quantity that's produced in our little world of our farmer and rancher. I'll talk a little bit more about the relative demand curve and why it looks normal, but in a nutshell, it looks like something you're comfortable with because as the relative price of potatoes changes, consumers substitute between potatoes and meat. If the relative price of relative price of potatoes goes up, people substitute away from potatoes towards meat. So this looks just like you're used to thinking about a demand curve. So now what we want to do is just draw what our relative supply curve looks like in this general example. So let's put it right down here. Oops. So now instead of having meat and potatoes, we've got wine and cheese. So our relative price here is going to be the price of cheese divided by the price of wine. Our relative quantity down here is going to be the quantity of cheese produced in home plus the quantity of cheese produced in foreign divided by the quantity of wine produced at home plus the quantity of wine produced in foreign. If you ever get confused about which goes on top and which goes on bottom, which goes in the numerator and which goes in the denominator, just remember that whatever you've put on the horizontal axis in your PPF picture, that's going to be the thing that's in the numerator. And that's the same if you've had your intermediate microeconomics class and you've talked about, say, indifference curve analysis and the marginal rate of substitution. That same rule applies. You probably recognize that. Now, the two prices that are going to be important in this picture are going to be the slope of our production possibilities frontier. And we've done the same thing here in this picture, this set of pictures is what we did here. Home has the smaller slope to their production possibilities frontier, and that slope is right here, the ratio of the unit labor requirements. So this is the unit labor requirement for cheese divided by the unit labor requirement for wine at home. Foreign's production possibilities frontier is steeper. So right up here is the unit labor requirement for cheese, cheese there, and an asterisk, divided by the unit labor requirement for wine, asterisk. That's going to be foreign's slope of its production possibilities frontier. We're going to have a horizontal segment, we're going to have a vertical segment, and another horizontal segment. You don't need to worry about spacing these out the right amount. That's not important. All that's important is that you get these two numbers in the right place, and then you get this in the right place. And this amount right here is going to be the amount of cheese that home produces, which will be this number, right? It's going to be the amount of labor divided by the unit labor requirement for cheese, divided by the amount of labor. This one would be labor in foreign divided by the unit labor requirement for wine in foreign. So it would be L star divided by the unit labor requirement for wine in foreign. So you can see that this set of pictures looks way more complicated than this does, because over here we've got our numbers filled in. And that gives you some comfort. This is an easier thing to look at than that. That, when you first look at it, looks confusing. So hopefully you can see that what your textbook is going to do is they're going to go through this. And if that's all you saw, that would be, I think, more challenging to wrap your head around. It's actually very simple. Okay, so when you're looking at what's going on in the book, just keep in mind that you've seen it before and it's not really that hard. What we need to do now is spend a little bit more time talking about that relative demand curve. So I'll clear the board and then we'll come back and talk about that. All right, let's think about our relative demand curve just a little bit more. So I've got a picture here where I've drawn my relative supply curve. If we were to think about a relative demand curve that came down and intersected that relative supply curve at some point inside this vertical segment, then, as I said a little bit ago, we've got kind of the normal example where the world relative price would fall in between the slopes of the production possibilities frontier for home and for foreign. And we would have the normal example where each country would specialize in the good for which they have the comparative advantage. And the relative price that trade would take place at would be given by this intersection point. And we'll do a numerical example in a video coming up here in just a little bit where we mathematically solve for that. But it's just a matter of finding this intersection. So this, of course, is our demand curve. But this relative demand curve, which, remember, its downward slope has to do with the relative price of cheese and the fact that as the relative price of cheese goes up, consumers substitute away from cheese towards wine. And so as the relative price goes up, the relative quantity goes down for cheese. If consumer world demand for cheese relative to wine were to decrease, we could have some situation where, say, the relative demand curve shifted back from D1 to D2. And now our intersection doesn't take place over here in this vertical segment, it takes place right here. In that case, the relative price of cheese would be equal to the slope of the production possibilities frontier for home, which would be this number right there. Foreign is going to specialize in the good for which they have the comparative advantage, but now home is going to produce some cheese and some wine. Or we could have a situation where our relative demand curve increased to, say, D3, in which case the world price would now be equal to whatever the slope of foreign's production possibilities frontier. Home would specialize completely in the good for which they have the comparative advantage, and now foreign would produce some of each good. Okay? And once you see this done mathematically, which we'll do in an upcoming video, it should be a little bit more clear than what it might be right now. But really all we're looking for is this intersection between the demand and supply curves, and the world price always has to either be equal to the slope of Home's production possibilities frontier, the slope of foreign's production possibilities frontier, or something in between. Okay? Let's talk now about just a quick numerical example. So if I were to give you some numbers for the unit labor requirements, then what you know is that we can easily take these unit labor requirements for Home, 1 and 2, and we can figure out what the slope of their production possibilities frontier is going to be. So the slope of the PPF for Home is going to be the unit labor requirement for cheese divided by the unit labor requirement for wine. It's going to be 1/2. And if we were going to think about the slope of the PPF for foreign, then it's going to be foreign's unit labor requirement for cheese divided by the unit labor requirement for wine, which is going to be equal to 2. So now when you drew your relative supply picture, the slope of Home's production possibilities frontier is the smallest one. That doesn't have to be the case. Foreign's PPF could have the smaller slope, and its number could go down here. But in our example, we're treating Home as if they have the comparative advantage in cheese. So this number over here would be 1/2. This number right up here would be 2. And what we know is that the world relative price is either going to be 1/2 or 2 or something in between, right? There's no way that you could draw a relative demand curve anywhere here that intersected our relative supply curve in a meaningful way that gave us a price other than something between 1/2 and 2. So now what we need to do is we need to think about another layer to this, the last complication that we'll add to it, and that's going to be to think about relative wages in each of these countries. We're talking about the relative output prices, but what we need to do now is think about the relative input prices. In other words, how much is labor going to be paid in Home and foreign? And that's actually very easy to do. So I need to clear this off and then we'll do that. Oftentimes you hear opponents of free trade make the argument that free trade takes advantage of workers in lower wage countries. So for example, the wage for workers in the United States is often many times higher than the wage for workers in Mexico. And you'll hear people say, well, we're just taking advantage of workers in Mexico, or we're doing a disservice to workers in the US. And so we need to, in order to be able to think more about the legitimacy of those arguments, we need to think about in our model what the relative wage looks like. How is wage determined in each country? So if we think about our example that we've been going through here, we've got Home specializing in cheese. So Home specializes in cheese. And so let's think about what that implies about the wage for workers in Home. They're going to be producing cheese. It takes, in our example, 1 hour to produce a pound of cheese. Takes 1 hour to produce 1 pound of cheese, or 1 unit of cheese. And so workers at Home that are producing that cheese are going to earn the value of 1 pound of cheese per hour. So workers earn the value of 1 pound or 1 unit of cheese. Let's say per hour. Now, foreign is going to specialize in wine. It takes 3 hours to produce 1 unit of wine. That means that workers in foreign are going to earn 1/3 the value of a unit of wine per hour. So workers earn 1/3 the value of a unit of wine. Now, let's think about how to convert that into dollar amounts, and we do it. It's actually very easy to do, but what we need to do is we need to know the value of a pound of cheese, or the value of a unit of cheese, and the value of a unit of wine in terms of dollars. So let's just pick some. Remember, it's the relative world price that matters. So the absolute magnitude of the two prices that I pick is irrelevant. Let's just suppose that the price of cheese is equal to $12. And let's suppose the price of wine is equal to $12. That tells us that the relative price is going to be equal to 12 over 12, which is equal to 1. And remember, that works given the numbers that I just used, because that falls in between the opportunity cost of cheese in home and the opportunity cost of cheese in foreign. We could pick any numbers here, right? These could be each $100, and it would still give us a relative price of 1. This is what's important. What I choose there isn't, but we need these numbers in order to convert these. Okay, so what this tells us is, since workers are going to earn in home the value of 1 pound of cheese per hour, and the price of a unit of cheese is $12, then the wage in home is going to be equal to $12. Let's say this is our home wage. Foreign, their workers are going to earn 1/3 the value of a unit of wine. 12 divided by 3 is going to be 4, so foreign wage will be equal to $4. As with prices, it's going to be the relative wage that matters, not so much these dollar amounts, but the relative wage. So if we think about the relative wage, and we can think about it either way. Let's think about the relative wage in home. It's going to be home's wage divided by foreign's wage, which would be 12 divided by 4, or 3. And that's really what's important. What matters is that workers in home are going to earn 3 times what workers in foreign are going to earn. And clearly these dollar amounts would change if we changed these dollar amounts up here, but what really matters is going to be this relative wage. Okay? So what we'll do in our next chapter is we're going to think about a couple of extensions of this, and then we're going to think also about a mathematical example. And I think once you see that mathematical example, you'll see that this is actually very easy to do.